They tell you a man only dies once. They are wrong, and I am the proof. My name is John Ellman. I was 46 years old the first time they killed me, and I had been a pianist before any of it began. That word means less now than it used to. The instrument I learned on had wooden hammers and ivory keys and the warm smell of resin in the felt, and it sat in a teaching room on a planet I have not stood on in 11 years. The coalition does not let men like me stand on planets anymore. They let us work, and they let us breathe, and they let us die on a schedule that suits them. Anything else is theft. Beaumont Station hung in the dark between two suns like a wheel a child had spun and forgotten. 40,000 human laborers lived in its lower rings, packed shoulder to shoulder in dormitory blocks the foreman called housing and we called the kennels. The upper rings belonged to the Vorr. That was where the council's spire rose out of the station's bones, a black needle of fused chitin and humming alloy, and that was where the law lived. I did not see the spire from the inside until the day they sentenced me. By then it was already too late. The Vorr were not the worst aliens we had met. I want to make that clear before I tell the rest of it. There were uglier species in coalition space, and crueler ones, and species who ate their own dead in front of you to see if it would make you flinch. The Vorr did none of that. The Vorr were precise. They stood almost 8 feet tall on 4 jointed legs, with a torso that rose vertical from the saddle of their hips and 2 pairs of arms that folded against the chest like a praying mantis at rest. Their faces were narrow and plated, with mandibles that clicked when they spoke and a band of black sensory eyes set in a strip across the brow. They smelled, faintly, of cold metal and crushed mint. I never got used to that. What made them what they were was inside the skull. The Vorr did not lie. They could not lie. Their hive shared a kind of low-level cognitive web, and a falsehood spoken aloud registered to the rest of them as a wound, the way you or I would register a knife sliding under a rib. So they had built their entire civilization on the premise that truth was the only currency, and they had built their law on top of that, and they had come to us 100 years ago and offered protection and order in exchange for our labor and our worlds. We took the deal because the alternative was worse. We always tell ourselves the alternative is worse. That is how we end up where we end up. The trouble with a species that cannot lie is that they assume no one else can either. They built courts that ran on testimony and signed declaration, and they built prisons that ran on confession, and they built an execution chamber on the 83rd deck of the spire that ran on a writ stamped by a Vorr judge and signed by a Vorr advocate and sealed by a Vorr witness, and once the seal was set, the writ could not be unmade. Truth was not subject to appeal. They believed this the way you and I believe gravity. They could not picture a world where a man would put his hand to a document and say a thing was so when it was not. They had no defense against it because, in their bones, they could not imagine it. The coalition humans figured this out faster than the Vorr ever did. By the time I was framed, there was a quiet apparatus of human handlers and human lawyers and human middlemen running the station's underbelly, and the Vorr Council sat above them filing clean reports and counting clean numbers, and never once suspecting that the numbers came in clean because the men below were lying to them in writing. The Vorr called it cooperation. We called it a racket. I called it the wall I walked into. I had served 10 years in the labor pens for a killing I did not do. That sentence had been handed down by a Vorr magistrate named Judge Roska, who had read the file the human prosecutor handed him and signed the writ in the calm belief that a signed document was equal to the truth it described. 10 years. I lost my hands to the work for a while, the calluses building up over the keys I would never play again, and when I came out of the pens my fingers had to learn a softness back. I was 45 years old and I had nothing. A man named Nolan found me in a dockside mess hall on my 3rd day of freedom and offered me what he called honest work. Nolan was a human lawyer. He wore a coalition pin on his lapel and a smile that did not move when his eyes moved. I should have walked. The work was simple, he said. Watch a residence on the 42nd deck. Note the comings and goings. Report at the end of the shift. He paid me half in advance, and the half was enough to eat for a month, and I told myself that a man who had lost 10 years to a lie was owed at least a meal that did not taste of regret. So I watched the residence. I did not know it belonged to Judge Rosca. I did not know that Nolan and his men were waiting in the corridor below with a kinetic pistol and a forged movement log. I did not know any of it until the alarms went, and the security cordon dropped, and the Vorr enforcers came around the corner with their mandibles wide, and found me standing in the corridor like a man at a bus stop, with my own thumbprint on the door panel and the judge's body cooling on the other side of it. Trigger Smith was the one who pulled the trigger, but I never saw him. I only saw the door and the smear on the wall behind it, and the eyes of the enforcer who took me down. I want to remember that I fought. I did not fight. I sat down in the corridor and put my hands behind my head and watched my own breath fog the cold air and thought about the second movement of a sonata I had played when I was 19. I thought, if this is the last clear thing in my head, it will do. It was not the last clear thing. It was only the first of many. The trial took 6 days. There were 2 witnesses who could have cleared me, a young couple named Nancy and Jimmy who had been on the 42nd deck that night and had seen Trigger Smith leaving the residence at the time the prosecutor claimed I was inside it. They worked as lab assistants for a human scientist named Dr. Evan Beaumont, an old man with a soft accent and gentle hands, and a fixed grant from the Vorr Medical Authority. Nancy and Jimmy were terrified. Nolan's men had been to their dormitory twice in the days before the trial and once during it, and the message had been delivered the way such messages always are. They sat in the gallery and watched me lose, and the worst part of it, the part I do not blame them for now but did blame them for then, was that I understood. They were children. They had a life to lose. I had already lost mine. The Vorr advocate assigned to my defense did not lie for me because he could not lie for me. He laid out the evidence as it had been written, and he asked the questions the writ permitted, and at the end of the 6th day Judge Rosca's successor, a senior magistrate named Vesk, read out the finding and the writ, and the seal was set, and that was the end of it. Vesk did not enjoy it. The Vorr do not enjoy executions. They simply do them the way you tighten a bolt. He looked at me from the bench with all 8 of his eyes and clicked his mandibles once slowly, and said in the trade language, "You have been judged. Be ready." I almost thanked him. The Vorr understand respect, and I had been raised to give it where it was owed, and the magistrate had at least followed his own law to its end. They held me 40 hours in a clean white cell on the 82nd deck. Nolan came to see me on the 2nd day. He sat on the other side of the partition and folded his hands the way a man folds them in church, and he told me that there was nothing he could do and that he was sorry, and that he would see to it that my body was returned to a decent place. I looked at him for a long time. I did not say what I wanted to say. I told him only this. I said, "Nolan, I am going to know. I do not know how, and I do not know when, but I am going to know what you did, and I am going to come around to your side of the partition." He laughed. He had a wet, careful laugh. He stood up and straightened his lapel pin and walked out. On the morning of the 3rd day, they walked me to the 83rd deck. The execution chamber was a circular room with a single chair at the center, ringed by a low railing for witnesses. The chair was not a chair the way you and I would build one. The Vorr had no electric chair, no gallows, no firing squad. They had a field generator and a contact harness, and the harness pressed 12 points against the skull and the spine and the heart, and the field stopped the body the way you stop a clock. Painless, the manual said. I will tell you what painless means when a Vorr writes the manual. It means the machine does not register your suffering. It does not mean you do not suffer. I sat in the chair. They locked the harness. Nancy and Jimmy were in the gallery. Beaumont was with them, the old scientist, and he was looking at me with an expression I did not understand at the time. He looked at me the way a man looks at a thing he wants. I closed my eyes. Vesk read the writ for the 2nd and final time. The field came on. I heard, somewhere very far away, the 2nd movement of that sonata I had thought about in the corridor. Then I heard nothing at all, and then for a long time I was nothing at all, and then I was something again. What happened next happened to a man named John Ellman, whose paperwork said he was dead. The Vorr Medical Authority had granted Beaumont a research warrant 6 years earlier to study the boundary state of post-execution tissue. The warrant was unusual, and it had been granted because Beaumont was an old man with a clean record and a quiet manner, and the Vorr trusted him the way they trusted all the human researchers who had never lied to them in writing. Beaumont had taken delivery of the bodies of 17 executed humans before me. None of them had ever opened their eyes again. He had a device he called the Lindbergh array, a cradle of vascular pumps and a synthetic heart engine the size of a coffee tin, and he had refined it in those 17 failures until the night he refined it on me. I was the 18th. I do not know what he changed. I only know what I felt. I felt the cold of the slab first, and then the burn of the chemical primer in my left arm, and then the rhythm of the synthetic heart catching against the rhythm my body had forgotten. I felt my chest move. I felt my eyelids learn that they were eyelids. I heard Beaumont say, in a soft, broken voice, "He is alive." He said it twice. The second time he said it, he was weeping. He was a good man. I want to put that down clearly. Beaumont was a good man, and he died for it. And nothing I did afterward was his fault. When I sat up the first time, the room tilted and the lights smeared, and I knew without being told that something was different in the room with me. There was a quiet in my head that had not been there before. Not silence. Quiet. The kind of quiet a long room takes on after a piano has stopped playing and the strings are still humming behind the lid. I could feel it inside my skull. I could feel something the size of a hand resting on the inside of my forehead, light and cool. And when Beaumont leaned forward and asked me my name, I knew his name before he asked. And I knew the names of the 2 young people behind him. And I knew the name of every man in the room who had ever wished me harm. I did not know how I knew. I have spent years trying to put a word to it. The closest I have come is this. The Vorr had a hive. They shared a low web of cognition between their kind, and when you stood near them, you could sometimes feel the edge of it, like standing near a transformer at night. Beaumont's Lindbergh array did something to the tissue of the brain when it brought it back. It tuned the tissue to a frequency I do not understand. And what I picked up on from the moment I sat up was a kind of human web that the Vorr had never noticed. Not telepathy. Nothing so clean. Call it a sense for the weight of a man's intentions when his intentions were heavy enough. Call it a debt meter. The men who had killed me had carried the killing inside them for weeks, and they had carried the lie inside them for weeks longer, and the weight had bent the space around them, and now I could feel that bend the way a blind man feels heat through a window. I could feel Nolan from the other side of the station. I sat on the slab in Beaumont's lab, and I did not speak for a long time. Nancy was crying. Jimmy was holding her shoulders. Beaumont was talking to me in a low voice, asking me about pain, about temperature, about whether I could see the lamp. I could see the lamp. I could see all of it. I asked for water. They brought me water. I asked after a while for a mirror. They hesitated. They brought the mirror. The man in the mirror was the man I had been and was not. My hair had gone white in 12 hours. The left side of my face had a slack to it that I have never lost. My eyes did not look like my eyes. They looked like a window someone had wiped clean from the wrong side. I looked at myself for a long time. Then I said, in a voice that was not yet the voice I have now, "Doctor, who arranged for my death?" Beaumont went still. He told me gently that he did not know. He told me the trial record was sealed under Vorr law and that he had only known I was innocent because Nancy and Jimmy had told him so 2 nights before the execution, and he had not been able to do anything in time. He told me that what he had done with the array, the bringing me back, was not legal under the warrant, and that he had done it because he could not let an innocent man stay dead while the men who killed him walked. He said all of this with his hands turned palm up on the table, the way a man does when he is asking to be believed. I believed him. I asked him to bring me a list of the names on the trial record. I asked him to bring me whatever he had on the men who had paid for the trial record. He looked at Nancy, and Nancy nodded, and Jimmy went out into the lab's outer office and came back 10 minutes later with a printed sheet. I read the names. I knew them before I read them. They were already inside my head, glowing like coals. Nolan, the lawyer. Loader, the enforcer who had walked Trigger Smith to the resident's door. Trigger Smith himself, the trigger. Merritt, the human magistrate's clerk who had filed the forged log. Blackstone, the man who paid for all of them. 5 names, 5 debts. I did not say I was going to kill them. I want to be clear about this too. I never said it, not in Beaumont's lab and not later, not to Nancy or Jimmy and not to the Vorr who eventually asked me. I did not need to say it. I do not believe I needed to do it either. What happened to those 5 men happened the way weather happens to a ship that has stopped maintaining itself. I went to find them one by one because I needed to know why. That was the truth of it. The killing was not my plan. The killing was what they did to themselves when they saw me standing in their doorway, after they had paid to have me put in the ground. I left Beaumont's lab 2 nights after I sat up. He did not want me to go. He had 100 questions about the synthetic heart and the tuning of the array and the new quiet in my head, and he wanted to write papers and present findings, and I think, in some small, honest way, he wanted to keep me near him because he had brought me back, and a man does not let go of a thing he has built. I did not blame him. I told him I would come back. I meant it when I said it. I borrowed a long coat from Jimmy and a pair of work boots from a locker, and I walked out of the lab into the maintenance corridors of the upper rings, and I went to find the first name on the list. Trigger Smith ran a card parlor on the 61st deck. He had been promoted, since I had last seen the dockside mess hall, from triggerman to middle manager, which I suppose is how the coalition rewards a successful framing. The parlor was a long, narrow room with a low ceiling and the wet smell of bodies and synth liquor. I stood in the doorway for the better part of a minute before anyone noticed me. When the noticing came, it came all at once. The card dealer dropped a deck. A woman in a back booth said a word I will not write here. Trigger looked up from his table with a glass halfway to his mouth, and the glass did not finish its trip. He knew me. He should not have. He had never met me, only watched me from a distance the night they put me at the judge's door. But he knew me anyway. The hair, I suppose, the face. The fact that I was supposed to be Ash in a Vorr disposal chute and was instead standing in his doorway in a coat too big for me. He stood up. He went for the pistol at his hip. I did not move. I did not need to move. I have thought about this part a great deal in the years since, and I want to be careful not to make it sound mystical. What I think happened is this. Trigger had carried the killing of Judge Rosca inside him for 9 months. He had drunk on it and slept badly on it and woken every morning with the picture of the judge's chest in his head. He had not told a Vorr about it because the Vorr could not bear to be told. He had not told a human about it because the humans who already knew did not need telling. He had carried it alone, and the carrying had eaten through the inside of him the way salt eats through a hull. When he saw me, the hull failed. He pulled the pistol up. His hand was shaking. The barrel wandered the way a barrel wanders when a man's wrist has gone soft on him. And the muzzle flash when it came was small and yellow and almost apologetic. He fired once. The shot went into the ceiling and the panel above his head sparked and the sprinkler line burst, and the water came down on him in a cold, sudden curtain that smelled of station mineral and old pipe. Trigger Smith stepped back from the falling water. His mouth was open. His eyes were on me, and not on the floor, and not on the bar stool he had pushed away from his table when he stood. His foot caught the rung of his own stool, and he went over backward into the synth liquor cabinet. The cabinet was old. The shelving inside it was alloy. He hit the back of his head against the lower shelf, and his neck did something it should not have done, and he did not get up again. I stood in the doorway and watched the water fall on him. The patrons did not move. The dealer was still standing behind the table with the dropped deck at his feet. The woman in the back booth had her hand over her mouth. None of them looked at me. They could not. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no triumph. I felt the coal in my head go cold where his name had been, the way an ember goes cold at the edge of a banked fire with no drama in the going, and I felt that one of 5 debts had been settled, and I walked out of the parlor before the patrons remembered they had legs. In the corridor the air was warmer and drier, and I stood there a moment with my hand on the wall, and I thought, This is not how I imagined any of this. I had imagined a confrontation. I had imagined questions and answers and a man begging. I had received a man dropping a glass and falling backward into his own cabinet, and the universe taking him off the board for me as if it had been waiting on a signal. I did not know yet that this was the pattern. I did not know yet that I had become a kind of weather. The Vorr would later call this an accident. The forensic report described the angle of the fall and the height of the shelf and the blood alcohol level, and the report was signed by a Vorr coroner who could not lie and who therefore had no reason to think his report would be inadequate. He did not write down that John Ellman had been standing in the doorway. He could not have written it down, because no Vorr in the parlor's surveillance feed could have seen me. The hive was not tuned to me. I do not know why. I think Beaumont's array had done something to the way the field cameras read me, the way I read the Vorr's intentions. We were on different frequencies. They could film me and not see me. They could stand in front of me and look past. I cannot explain this fully. I am telling you what I lived. Merritt was the second name. He was the clerk who had filed the forged movement log, and he was the easiest to find because he had not gone to ground. He believed himself untouchable. The Vorr trusted his paperwork. The Vorr trusted his paperwork because he had never produced a document that any Vorr could find an error in, and the Vorr equated absence of error with presence of truth. He worked in a clerk's bay on the 73rd deck, behind a low partition, with a window that looked out over the slow turn of the station's outer ring. I went to him at the end of his shift. I waited in the corridor until he came out alone. He came out alone because he always came out alone. He was a man with no friends and no enemies, only a ledger. He saw me. He said, "Oh, just that." Oh, as if he had remembered an appointment he had let slip. I asked him a single question. I asked him who had paid him to file the log. I did not raise my voice. I did not raise my hand. I stood at the partition with my hands in the pockets of Jimmy's coat, and I waited. He looked at me, and the coal in my head burned, and the burning was a slow, steady thing now, the way a lamp burns when the wick is trimmed, and he said, in a thin, small voice, "Blackstone." He said Blackstone paid him 500 coalition credits and a promotion. He said it the way a man says a thing in confession, with the relief of a man putting down a load. Then he turned around and walked back into the clerk's bay and closed the door behind him. I did not follow. I did not need to. 40 minutes later, the Vorr security found him in his washroom, hanging from the towel rail by his own belt. The Vorr coroner wrote that the clerk had suffered a long bout of nervous strain. The Vorr coroner could not have written anything else. The truth of it was that Merritt had carried his lie for a year and had not been able to carry it the moment a man who knew the lie stood in front of him and said nothing. The lie killed him. I only stood there. I tell myself that on the nights when I am inclined to tell myself things. I only stood there. The standing was the thing. The standing was always the thing. Nolan came next. I had thought he would be the hardest. He was the cleverest of the five, and he had the most to lose, and he had spent the most time arranging buffers between himself and the work. But cleverness only protects a man against other clever men. It does not protect him against a creditor who has already paid the worst price he can pay. Nolan was in his office on the 78th deck when I came in. He had a Vorr legal liaison on a screen and a coffee in his hand, and his lapel pin sat at the same neat angle it had always sat. He saw me, and he dropped the coffee. He scrambled. He came around the desk and got a hold of an emergency call panel and pressed it, and the panel rang once and stopped because the Vorr station master on the other end was not in his chair. Nolan tried again. The panel rang and stopped. He looked at me. He looked at the door. He went for the door, and the door's autolock cycled at the wrong moment, the way a door does once or twice in a decade, and he hit the door at full speed with his hands out, and his coffee-slick hands slipped, and he went into the door's edge with his temple and slid down it and lay still. I stood in his office and watched him for some time. I did not check on him. I knew. The coal went cold. 3 debts settled. 2 to go. I want to tell you something here, because if I do not tell you now, I will not have the heart to tell you later. None of this gave me what I had thought it would give me. I had imagined, when I was in the white cell waiting to be walked to the chair, that if a miracle happened and I came back and the men who had killed me died for it, I would feel some kind of weight lift. I had imagined I would feel like a man who had set an account right. What I felt when I walked out of Nolan's office and into the corridor of the 78th deck was older and colder than that. I felt the absence of him. I felt the place where his particular weight had bent the space and now did not. The world was lighter by one man and I did not feel lighter. I felt only tired and a little cleaner, the way a man feels after he has scrubbed a wound. The scrubbing does not make the wound less of a wound. It only makes it less of an infection. Loader I found in a docking bay on the lower rings. He was supervising the loading of a cargo run, 6 Vorr stevedores and a human crew chief, and a stack of alloy crates marked for a colony 2 systems away. The bay smelled of grease and cold metal, and the faint sour tang the Vorr give off when they are working hard. Loader was a big man. He had been a station enforcer for 15 years. He had broken human heads for the coalition, and he had broken Vorr mandibles too when the Vorr were not looking, and he had carried the killing of Judge Raska as a kind of trophy. He saw me from across the bay. He pointed. He shouted a word at the human crew chief, and the crew chief turned and looked at me, and the crew chief saw an old man in a coat too big for him and laughed and went back to the manifest. Loader came at me himself. He was not the kind to send other men. He came across the bay with his hand on his service baton, the baton out of its holster now and held low at his hip, and his face was red and getting redder, and 20 paces out he tripped over a power cable that had been laid across the deck plates an hour earlier by a stevedore he had cursed at for laying it slowly. He went down hard. The baton skidded out of his grip and rang on the deck plate, a small high note in the noise of the bay. He got up. He came on. 10 paces out a Vorr stevedore turned a loading arm at exactly the wrong moment, the way a stevedore does when his foreman is angry and his attention is elsewhere, and the arm caught Loader across the side of the head with the soft chime alloy makes when it strikes bone. A sound like a tuning fork dropped on a table, and Loader went down again and did not get up. The stevedore went still. He looked at the body. He looked at me across the bay. The Vorr do not feel guilt the way we do, but they feel error. And the stevedore had felt error register on him from the swing he had made. And now he was standing over a dead human, and the error was on his ledger. I crossed the bay. The stevedore watched me come. I stopped 2 paces from him. I looked up at his 8 black eyes, and I said in the trade language, "This man would have died today regardless. You are not at fault. Continue your work." The stevedore clicked his mandibles. He clicked them once slow, the way Judge Vesk had clicked his on the morning of my execution. He said nothing. He went back to his loading arm. He continued his work. The crew chief who had laughed at me earlier was staring at me from the manifest stand with his mouth open. I walked past him and out of the bay and into the corridor, and the door cycled shut behind me, and the coal in my head went cold for the 4th time. One name left. The man who had paid for all of them. Blackstone was harder. He was not a station-side man. He owned a private hab on a stalk off the upper ring, a glass-walled module that turned slowly under its own ring of artificial gravity, and he had 3 coalition guards on the access bridge and 2 Vorr enforcers on the inner door, and a private corridor that ran from his hab to a shuttle bay where a yacht waited at all hours. I could not walk to him. I could not stand in his doorway. I could not let the world settle his account for me, because his world had been built to keep the world out. I went back to Beaumont's lab. Beaumont and Nancy and Jimmy were waiting for me. They had been waiting for 4 days. None of them had slept properly. Nancy had been crying. Jimmy had a kinetic pistol on the bench in front of him, an old one, the kind a dock worker keeps in his locker against the day he wishes he had not needed it. They did not ask me what I had done. They had heard the reports. The station news feeds had run notices on the deaths of Smith and Merritt and Nolan and Loader, 4 men in 4 days, all of them ruled accidental by Vorr coroners who could not have ruled anything else. The coalition humans who had known the five for what they were had drawn their own conclusions and gone very quiet. The Vorr had drawn their own conclusions as well, and the conclusions were not the ones the humans had drawn. The Vorr had noticed a pattern in the accidents. The Vorr were going to investigate. Beaumont said, "John." He said only my name for a long moment. Then he said, "You need to leave the station. I have a friend on a freighter. I can get you to a colony. You can disappear." I told him I had one more name. He closed his eyes. He had a face like an old leather glove that had been wrung out and dried in the sun. He said, "John, please." He said, "You have done what you came to do. You have done more than you came to do. Let the last one go. Let him live with himself." I told him a man like Blackstone does not live with himself. A man like Blackstone hires other men to do the living for him. I told him I would not be able to lie down at night knowing that the man who had paid for my death was still drinking his coffee in a glass-walled hab and writing his next order. I told him that what I had become in his lab was not a thing I could put away half-finished. I told him I was sorry. Nancy stood up. She was shaking. She said, "I will help you." She said it in a small voice and then in a steadier voice. Jimmy put his hand on her wrist and she shook him off, and she said it a third time, "I will help you. I have been afraid for a year and I am tired of being afraid. I work on the upper ring. I have access to the air handling on Blackstone's stock. I can get you in." Jimmy stared at her. Beaumont stared at her. I stared at her. She was 23 years old. She had testified against me by failing to testify, and she had wept in Beaumont's lab when I came back, and she had earned, in the 4 days since, the right to look at me the way she was looking at me now. I told her no. I told her she had her life ahead of her and she was not going to throw it on the same fire I had thrown mine on. She told me to stop talking. She said, "I let you die once. I will not do it twice. I want to tell you what happened in Blackstone's hab. I want to tell you the way it deserves to be told. I am not sure I can." Nancy got me onto the stalk through a maintenance shaft that ran along the gravity coupling. I crawled for 40 minutes in a service tunnel 2 feet across, in the dark, with the low hum of the coupling under my hands. I came out in a utility closet on the underside of the hab. Nancy was on a comm in Beaumont's lab, guiding me by a station schematic she had pulled from her work account. Jimmy was at the lab door with the pistol, watching the corridor. Beaumont was sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes closed. He was praying. I did not know he was a praying man. I learned a great deal about Beaumont in those weeks. I came out of the closet into Blackstone's private corridor. 2 Vorr enforcers stood at the inner door. They did not see me. The hive frequency was wrong, the way it had been wrong since I sat up on Beaumont's slab. I walked past them at arm's length. One of them clicked his mandibles. I do not know if he was uneasy. I will never know. I went through the inner door, which Nancy had unlocked through the air-handling control panel, and into Blackstone's living quarters. He was at a long glass table eating dinner. There was a Vorr legal liaison across from him, in a posture cradle the Vorr use when sitting with humans. They were discussing a contract for the next quarter's labor allocations. Blackstone looked up. He saw me. The Vorr liaison turned his head slowly, the way a Vorr turns its head when it is taking in something new. Blackstone did not panic. I will say that for him. He was a man who had built his life on never panicking. He set his fork down. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked at the Vorr across from him, and he said, in the trade language, "This is not a person who is here. The records will show that this is not a person who is here." He was telling the Vorr a lie. He was telling it on the assumption that the Vorr could be told. The Vorr cannot lie, but a great many of them have learned, over 100 years of working with us, to tolerate being lied to as long as the lie is plausible and quiet, and lets the work go forward. Blackstone had built his fortune on this tolerance. He had built it on the soft place at the edge of the Vorr web where a falsehood from a human registered not as a wound, but as a confusion, a static, a thing to be filed for later. And it had worked every time for every other lie he had told. But the Vorr across from him knew me. I want to say this carefully. He knew of me. He had read the writ of my execution 6 days ago. He had been the legal liaison who countersigned the seal. He had watched the recording of my death because that was what a countersigning liaison did at the close of his ledger. He had seen my face under the harness. And now my face was in front of him, in the same coat I had not been wearing in the lab footage, and his hive was registering nothing, and the human across the table was telling him that I was not a person who was here. The lie hit the Vorr's web the way a knife hits a rib. I saw him flinch. His 8 eyes shrank. His mandibles came together in a hard, sharp clack, and a small black bead of fluid welled from the seam at his throat where the chitin met the soft tissue. He stood up. He was 8 feet of pure offended law. He looked at Blackstone and he said in the trade language, "You have spoken a falsehood in my presence, and I have countersigned the writ of this man's death." He said it the way a Vorr judge reads a finding. He said the seal cannot be unmade. The man before me cannot be the man I sealed. Therefore one of 2 things is true. Either he is not the man I sealed, in which case you have produced him under false declaration, or he is the man I sealed, in which case your declaration of his death was incomplete and the seal was set in error. He raised his upper pair of arms slowly. He said, in either case, your standing as a sworn party before the council is forfeit. Blackstone tried to speak. He could not. He had built his life on the soft tolerance, and the soft tolerance had a floor, and the floor had a name, and the name was countersigning liaison. The Vorr crossed the room in 3 strides. He had 4 arms, and he used all of them. Blackstone made a sound that was not a word. He went over the edge of the long glass table, and his head went into the table's corner, and the glass took him at the temple. And that was all of Blackstone, and the coal in my head went cold for the 5th and final time. The Vorr turned to me. I held still. I do not know what I expected. I expected to be killed, I think. I expected the hive to register finally. That I was the man on the slab from 6 days ago, and to do what its law required. He looked at me for a long time. He stood there with the black bead of fluid drying at his throat and his mandibles moving, slowly, the way a man moves his lips when he is reading. Then he said, in the trade language, very quietly, "You are a debt." I said, "I am." He said, "A debt cannot be unmade. A debt can only be paid." I said, "I know." He said, "Walk out of this hab, walk out of the inner door. Walk past the enforcers. They will not see you. The hive will record nothing. I will write the report. The report will say that the human Blackstone struck his head in a fall and that a Vorr legal liaison was present and that no other person was in the room. The report will not be a lie." He paused. He said, "A debt is not a person." I walked out. I went back through the inner door. The 2 Vorr enforcers stood at their post. They did not see me. I went back through the service tunnel. I came out in the utility closet behind Beaumont's lab. Nancy was waiting. She had a cup of tea in her hand. She put it down when she saw me. She did not ask. Jimmy was at the door with the pistol. Beaumont was sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the wood. He opened his eyes when I came in. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "Is it over?" I said, "It is over." He said, "Will you stay?" I said, "No." Beaumont died 11 days later. The Vorr Medical Authority pulled his warrant. They did not pull it because they had found out what he had done with me. They pulled it because the countersigning liaison from the Blackstone Hab had filed an addendum to the authorities' research ethics ledger noting that the Lindbergh array had produced an outcome the Vorr could not catalog. The Vorr cannot tolerate the uncatalogued. They closed the lab. They confiscated the array. Beaumont went home to his small dormitory and lay down on his bed and did not get up the next morning, and the medical report said heart failure, and the medical report was not wrong and was not the truth either. He was an old man and he had carried a thing that was not his to carry. The carrying killed him. I have thought a great deal about whether I should have let him bring me back. I have not come to an answer. I do not think there is one. Nancy and Jimmy left the station a month later on a colony transport. Nancy had family on a frontier world 4 jumps out, and the Vorr did not stop her, And the coalition did not stop her either, because the coalition had quietly decided that anyone connected to Beaumont's lab was a problem better solved by distance. I did not see them off. I did not want them to be seen at a dock with me. I sent a note. I told Nancy that what she had done in the 4 days after I sat up was the bravest thing I had ever seen a human do, and that I owed her a debt I would not be able to pay, and that I hoped the world she went to would be quieter than the one she was leaving. I do not know if she got the note. I hope she did. I stayed on Beaumont Station for another 6 weeks. I did not need to. The Vorr countersigning liaison had filed his report, and the report had held, and no one was looking for me. But there was a thing I had to do, and I could not leave until I had done it. I went, on a slow rotation of nights, to the 83rd deck. I went to the execution chamber. The chamber was not in use the weeks I went. The Vorr execute infrequently. The chamber sat empty under low light, with the chair at its center, and the harness folded against the cradle, and the field generator humming the low hum of a machine that is not asleep and not awake. I sat in the chair the second time of my own accord. I did not turn the harness on. I sat in the chair with my hands on the rests, and I let the room remember me. I let myself remember the room. I sat there for an hour at a time on those nights. I thought about the sonata. I thought about Beaumont. I thought about Nancy in a small voice, and then a steadier voice saying she would help me. I thought about the Vorr liaison saying very quietly that a debt is not a person. I came to think over those 6 weeks about what the Vorr had built and what we had done inside it. The Vorr had built a civilization on the premise that truth was the only currency. They had built it honestly. They had offered it to us in good faith. And we had walked into it with the easy lies of a species that survives on the bend of the truth, and we had bent the truth in their courts and their ledgers and their contracts, and we had used their soft tolerance to do murder and to do worse than murder. And 100 years on we had built a small private empire inside their honest one, and they had let us, because the alternative for them was a kind of pain they did not have the tissue to bear. They were not weak. They were not stupid. They were honest, and we had used their honesty against them, and they had let us because to do otherwise would have been to become a little bit like us. I had been the cost of that arrangement. So had a great many other humans on Beaumont Station, men and women whose names I never learned, whose framings had been smaller than mine, and whose deaths had been quieter. The Vorr had signed the writs. The Vorr had set the seals. The Vorr had also, somewhere in their long, honest patience, known that something was wrong with the numbers, and had chosen not to look, because looking would have hurt. The countersigning liaison in Blackstone's hab had finally looked. He had looked because the lie had been told to his face by a man eating dinner with him, and the looking had broken something in him, and the breaking had cost Blackstone his life, and Beaumont his warrant, and me my reason to stay. I left Beaumont Station on a slow freighter at the end of the 6th week. I worked the galley in exchange for passage. The captain did not ask my name. The crew did not ask either. They were dock workers and old hands, and they had seen enough of the coalition to know that a man with white hair and a slack face and a coat too big for him was a man who had paid a price and did not want to talk about it. I worked and I ate, and I slept 4 hours at a stretch, and I watched the stars from the galley port at the back of my shifts, and I thought about the second movement of the sonata. I have been on the move for 11 years now. I have worked galleys and dockside kitchens, and one short stretch as a janitor in a frontier school where the children did not know me and were not afraid of me. I do not stay long anywhere. I have not played the piano again. My hands learned softness back in the year after the lab, but they did not learn the keys back. I do not know why. I have a guess. A man who has carried a coal in his head for 5 names does not have a hand for the second movement of a sonata. The hand is on a different instrument now. The coalition still runs Beaumont Station. The Vorr still sit in the spire. The arrangement still holds. I hear from the freighters that come through the frontier worlds that the Vorr Council passed a quiet reform 2 years after I left, that the soft tolerance has narrowed, that human ledgers are countersigned twice now, and human declarations are crossed against 3 witnesses and a Vorr observer instead of 1. I hear that human convictions in Vorr courts have fallen by half. I hear that the coalition humans in the upper rings are quietly furious about it, and that they cannot say so out loud because saying so out loud would be saying out loud what the soft tolerance had been for. I hear that the countersigning liaison who let me walk out of Blackstone's hab was promoted. I hear he sits on the council now. I hear that he files his reports very carefully and that he asks more questions than the old ones did. I do not know if any of this is true. I want it to be true. I am old enough now that wanting and knowing are not as different to me as they used to be. I do not regret what I did. I want to put that down too, plainly, because a man my age owes the truth on a page. I do not regret the 5 names. I do not regret the long crawl through the maintenance shaft or the long walk through Blackstone's corridor. I do not regret any of it. I regret only Beaumont, and I regret only that he had to die in a small dormitory bed for the work of bringing back a man who came back wrong. He deserved better than that. He deserved a paper in a journal and a chair at a university, and a long, quiet retirement on a planet with rain in it. I gave him none of those things. He gave me back the world, and I gave him an early grave for it, and the math of that exchange will not balance no matter how many ways I run it. I am writing this on a small frontier world. Vorr jumps out from anywhere. I will not say which. The light here is a tired yellow, and the gravity is a little low, and the air smells faintly of dust and dry grass and something else I cannot place, something honest. There is a piano in the schoolhouse a half-mile down the road. The teacher told me last week that the C above middle C is out of tune. I have not gone in. I do not know if I will go in. I think about it most nights, and most nights I decide against it, and last night for the first time I decided maybe. We will see. The hand is still on a different instrument. The instrument is quieter now than it used to be. The coals are all cold. The web is gone, or I am gone from it, and the quiet in my head is just a quiet now and not a tuning. I do not know what happens to a man who has been pronounced dead by the law and then walks the rest of his life unsealed. I do not think the Vorr know either. I do not think anyone knows. I think we live, the way men have always lived, in the absence of an answer, and we do the work in front of us, and we set down the work we are not asked to do, and at the end we hope someone honest will write the report. That is all of it. That is what happened on Beaumont Station in the months after I sat up on Beaumont's slab. I am John Ellman. I was a pianist once. I have been a debt, and I have been a man, and I have been a thing the Vorr could not catalog. I am today an old man on a frontier world with a yellow sun and a half-mile of dirt road between him and a piano that needs tuning. A man only dies once. That part is true. The rest of what they tell you about it is not.